In case I hadn't made it clear in the last couple of videos, 1993 was an extremely busy year for Epic, and I've still got 2 more videos to go before I cover it entirely. The year also marked their first venture into publishing games for Microsoft Windows, which at this point was an environment that sat on top of DOS and didn't have the honour of being a true completely functional operating system. Some people might say this hasn't changed. In the late 80s, when Windows wasn't yet Microsoft's exclusive focus, a software engineer at the company called Rick Saada started a hobby project of writing a fantasy game to teach himself the currently in development Windows 3 programming environment. As the game grew, it became quite popular with other people who worked with him, and it eventually turned into Castle of the Winds and was picked up by Epic Megagames for publication. Castle of the Winds describes itself as a graphical adventure, but it isn't. It's a role-playing game in the roguelike subgenre. This type of game is characterised by having the player explore dungeons consisting of randomly generated rooms and corridors in a turn-based play environment, having to fight enemies within it and scavenging for useful items to equip or sell. Usually, these games use a permadeath system where saves are only used to suspend the game temporarily, and a character who dies cannot be restored. This interpretation, however, is nice enough to let you save your game at any time and restore it regardless of whether your character is alive or not. The storyline is fairly typical for RPGs of this type. You star as a beefy man in pants who is out to seek vengeance for the murdered godparents who raised him. The farm he grew up in was burned down by an unknown enemy just after he learned of the existence of an amulet that was left to him by his real father, which is implied to have some mysterious power. Guessing that this is what they were after, he sets out for the local monster high-rise flat on a quest to get it back. The background of the game is inspired by Norse mythology, although it takes a while to become apparent. Within the dungeons, you'll still be fighting the usual kobolds, zombies and small mammals to gradually build up experience and unlock new abilities. Each stage of the game has you travelling back and forward between the dungeon and a town with a variety of shops. Your health constantly regenerates over time, and you can choose to sleep anywhere and restore yourself to full health and magic points. However, if you try it in a dungeon, you have the risk of being interrupted by the arrival of an enemy who will score a free hit on you. The real purpose of the town is to provide a place for you to sell or identify the items you've hoovered up from the dungeon, and to get incrementally better equipment for yourself. Better weapons and armour will become available in the shops the further in the game you are. Each shop has its own price that it's willing to pay for items. Olaf's junk shop will accept absolutely any old rubbish that you've hauled up, but at a fixed price of 25 copper pieces for anything. If you want a better price for the items you've found, you have to sell them to the right person. For example, a blacksmith will be willing to pay more for good weapons, and an outfitter will be interested in cloaks and other non-armour clothing items. As far as controls go, you have a choice of whether to drag everything around with the mouse or use keyboard controls, with movement being supported either via the arrow keys or a remarkably awkward layout on the letters that mimics the original Rogue game. I found the best way to play was to use the 2 control schemes in tandem, with movement and some actions being done on the keyboard and the mouse supporting the more obviously drag and drop suited parts like inventory management. It definitely shows that the game was made as an experiment with the Windows 3 API, as the game uses standard Windows elements like pull-down menus, sub-windows and scrollable panes wherever it can instead of creating its own, and it looks and feels almost like playing a database as a result. Some of the menu items are suffixed with an exclamation mark as if they're shouting at you, but this was UI shorthand at the time for a menu item that immediately performed a command, this being from the days before people realised that if an apparent drop-down menu performed a command, it shouldn't be on the menu. I started the game intending to play a very physical attack-heavy character, but the nature of the game leads you to relying on magic as much as your brute strength. If you charge bravely into all the monsters you see, you'll find you run out of health very quickly. You begin with 1 spell from a choice of 5, and every time you level up you gain access to 1 more. These can include projectile attack spells that save you from having to get close to enemies, magic that helps you detect items or enemies nearby, defensive buffs or healing and so on. In a nice touch, you can organise your most frequently used spells on the bar of icons at the top of the screen for quick access. Your inventory is limited and all items have both a weight and a bulk to worry about. Bulk represents the size of items, and you have an absolute limit on the amount of bulk that you can carry at any time. Weight is slightly different. Your character also has a maximum weight limit, but you can exceed this at the cost of slowing yourself down. Your current speed is shown on the panel at the bottom right of the screen, speed of performing actions on the left, and movement speed on the right. The less weighed down you are, the higher these will be, so if you limit the amount you're carrying, you'll find you're able to keep a safe distance from the monsters in the dungeon a lot more easily, because you'll get 2 moves for every 1 move that they take. Below this, the in-game time since the start of the story is shown. You're never under pressure of time, but having got through the game quickly without having to rest and recuperate too much is used as a measure of the player's success at the end. I quite enjoyed what I played of Castle of the Winds. I was surprised to get out of the first dungeon so quickly because I had remembered it being a huge undertaking when I played this earlier in life, but it's possible I was just lucky with the randomly generated dungeon layout. You definitely get a rewarding sense of becoming more powerful and being able to stay away from the towns for longer stretches at a time as the game goes on. As far as flaws go, the lack of any kind of animation in the main game view is fairly off-putting. You really have to watch the text scroll on the bottom left to keep track of whether you're hitting or being hit during a fight, and having some icons pop up next to your character representing damage, misses or immunity would have gone a long way to making it more immediately obvious what's going on in combat. And there's an annoying bug or feature that takes mana points away from you the moment you select a spell in the list, even if you cancel it before you select a tile to cast it in, but points are easily recovered by resting. On the positive side, one unexpected nice touch is that the game allows you to customise the appearance of your character by dropping in any Windows 3 icon file. Exactly like the previous RPG that we looked at, Castle of the Winds was split into two chapters, the shareware episode called A Question of Vengeance, and the registered one called Lithrancer's Bane. Both parts can be downloaded from myabandonware.com, and you can copy a character file from the end of the first game into the next one to continue where you left off. I wouldn't normally recommend this site by name because it's named after a made-up state of game copyright that was invented entirely to make people feel better about pirating aging games, but in this case the author has declared it's okay to give both parts of the game away for free. You can find his homepage on the Internet Archive under this address for ex-Microsoft employees, but the site is no longer up and the zip has not been archived. As the game is a 16-bit Windows exe, it will be a challenge to actually get running if, like most of the world, you're on a 64-bit operating system. You'll need an OS with 16-bit support to run it, either by setting up a virtual machine or installing it on DOSBox and running it through there. To run the game myself, I used a ready-made package of Windows for Work groups that's set up for DOSBox. It was put together by an enthusiast from Poland called the Fifth Horseman, and you can obtain it on Abandonia at the address below. Epic's second Windows 3.1 game, Dare to Dream, was also to be their last, implying that the venture into Microsoft's new environment wasn't entirely satisfactory. At this stage, Windows was really intended for business software that benefited from a consistent UI, and wasn't an ideal environment for the processor-intensive games they had been making. Dare to Dream, however, is fairly suited to the window and mouse environment, as it's a first-person adventure game along the lines of the classic Nintendo titles Shadowgate or Uninvited. The story is unexpectedly grim and is very much at odds with the cartoonish, boggle-eyed visuals throughout the game. You take the role of a young boy called Tyler and explore his troubled psyche through strange places that manifest in his dreams. Vague biblical symbolism pervades throughout the game as you discover more about what these places are and what they represent, and there are some very dark turns such as the end of the first episode where you transition from an uncanny but cheerful environment directly into a field of impaled burning corpses. The game is presented awkwardly in 3 individual floating windows that you can pull about wherever you like, although at the time of its release many people would have been stuck with a 640x480 resolution, which makes the game fit to the size of the screen. In the top right corner is the main view, where you can click on things within Tyler's field of vision to get a description of them in the text box at the bottom, and double-click them to attempt to interact with things. Particularly important items, along with spots that will move you to other screens, are highlighted by the cursor changing appearance when you hover over them, but it's hard to pinpoint what's considered important and what isn't just by looking. On the left of the screen, some more of the game's controls are presented using the metaphor of a television remote, which is a strange choice for 1993 as the concept of adventure games, as well as using buttons with the mouse, was pretty well established by this point. Nevertheless, this gives some additional possibilities on top of just walking around and poking things, giving you access to a talk command and letting you view and select items from your inventory. Dialogue with other characters is very basic, with each one giving you just a few questions to click through to check their responses. Unlike Castle of the Winds, Dare to Dream supports music via the sound card, once again provided by Robert A. Allen. You can tell that this wasn't a universal given for Windows games at the time, due to the game asking you to check things like whether you've got mmsystem.dll installed during its sound setup. Turning the music on will add a nostalgic selection of early Microsoft General MIDI sounds to the background of the game. One of the major obstacles to enjoying Dare to Dream as a game is what you might call an over-enthusiastic adherence to its setting. That is, being based on a dream, naturally many of its puzzles rely on the player using dream logic to solve them. Putting this another way, the game does not make a lick of sense. The first red flag I discovered during my exploration of the first episode was when, in desperation at having no apparent way forward, I attempted to use a fish on a door and was surprised to discover that this was exactly the intended solution. Demonstrating another problem prevalent in graphical adventure games, I had acquired this fish a few minutes earlier by persistently exploring around an unremarkable section of a boat, only for it to spring out at me once I discovered the exact spot to click on. Pixel hunts are distressingly common throughout the game. There are a couple of blatantly intentional ones, where you have to hover your cursor meticulously through an immense pile of identical items for the single one you can interact with, but even besides those, the hitboxes aren't made very obvious. Even the act of moving about is pretty awkward, with the game often being very picky about where you have to put your cursor to get the option to exit to another screen. It really can't be stressed enough how rare it is for puzzles to make any sense whatsoever, giving me more of a sense of relief than anything else when I was able to work out a next step by myself instead of consulting a walkthrough. Occasionally, you'll have to work out that using an oxygen tank on a pond will allow you to submerge yourself beneath it, and arguably you could say that it's logical that using an inflated helium balloon on the sky will allow you to float up to a building's roof. But more commonly, you'll be faced with things like a deadly toxic pool of nuclear waste that can only be passed by laying a small pair of pants across it, or a path-blocking evil bat that turns to stone when you show it a flower. Dialogue with other characters is typically unhelpful. There's one character who, in a preview of Epic's later first-person shooter success, you have to convince to give you some fishing equipment by immediately shotgunning him in the face. It really is only possible to play the game by using objects and other objects virtually at random to finally find where the dream is meant to take you. An easy mode exists that's meant to be for younger players, and this eliminates some of the puzzles, but without much visible selectivity as to whether they're the ones that make any sense or not. Despite its flaws, Dare to Dream marked an important point for Epic, as it was their first title written by Cliff Bleszinski. He was later to become one of the most recognisable faces of Epic, and would stay with the company for 20 years, working with Tim Sweeney and James Schmaltz on the Unreal series and directing Gears of War. Back in the early 90s, Tim Sweeney and Mark Rain were scouring CompuServe and Usenet for people who were releasing interesting titles and reaching out to bring them on board. Cliff was noticed for a very similar graphical adventure game that he'd released when he was 15 called The Palace of Deceit. The first attempt at this had been a text adventure called The Secret of Castle Lockmoor, but in 1992, using a rudimentary combination of Visual Basic and MS Paint, Cliff remade it into its better-known version subtitled The Dragon's Plight. In this, you play as an anthropomorphic dragon trying to escape from a sorcerer's castle by adventuring through its rooms and dungeons. From today's perspective, I really enjoy seeing on the Shareware About page that Cliff had the ambition of joining one of the big game companies of the time, knowing now that he was able to fulfill his goal in a way bigger than I think he could ever have imagined. The Palace of Deceit and all 3 episodes of Dare to Dream are available to play on archive.org. If you'd like to download them locally, you'll encounter the same obstacles as for Castle of the Winds, as you'll need a 16-bit installation of Windows to play them. If you look back at the games that we've explored so far, you'll notice that something that made Epic stand out as distinct from other shareware publishers was the wide range of game genres that they were experimenting with. They had released action games, pinball, an RPG and an adventure, shoot-em-ups, puzzles and other games that were all over the map. Meanwhile, Apogee took a much safer approach with their winning formula of side-scrolling platformers, and id Software found their niche with technically astonishing first-person shooters or games that included at least one shotgun. The game that is approximately called Xargon was just Epic's second side-scroller, and Apogee was releasing more of those per year than Epic would in their entire existence. The date on the game file suggests it was written during 1993, even though the game's publishing date is 1994, so I'm considering it an honorary 1993 game, mostly because it makes the length of these videos balance a little better. In Zargon, you play as an archaeologist with the sublimely implausible name of Malvinius Havershim. According to the backstory, he's investigating a structure in Madagascar built by a newly discovered ancient race called the Blue Builders, when he sets off some kind of trap that causes him to lose consciousness and awaken in a strange platform game world. It's now up to him to fight his way through the hostile traps and creatures he's faced with, occasionally being given unhelpful advice by a talking eagle called Silvertongue, and to defeat the evil overlord called Zargon to find his way home. This was the second complete game in the Epic lineup by Allen Pilgrim, and also saw Joe Hitchens and Dan Froelich returning for graphics and music. Bear in mind that even though I covered Kiloblaster approximately 46 videos ago, this game was released only about a year after it. Zargon was based on the Jill of the Jungle engine and plays noticeably similarly, but everything is drawn a bit bigger and it makes much better use of the VGA palette. It's interesting that you can also recognise some of Allen's particle and text effects that he experimented with in Kiloblaster, transplanted into a platform game context. Like Jill before him, Splendiferous Cabbage Chin can only move in grid spaces that are half his width, but the game generally plays at a fast enough pace for this not to become a real distraction. Zargon plays a lot like its predecessor, but the extra horizontal screen size is very welcome, and it adds a couple of elements that Jill didn't have. The overworld in each episode is presented in Jill 3's top-down map form, and you have a limited choice as to the order in which you complete the levels, though you'll always have to visit every level to collect all the required keys and plot-related items in the end. Along the way, you'll also get snippets of story in the form of entries that Michael for Loud Biscuits writes in his journal. In the main stages, once again you can pick up various weapons. You default to using some sort of slow-firing crotch laser that goes mercifully unexplained, and unusually but nicely it allows you to apply some aftertouch to it so that you can hit short enemies or those on ledges slightly above or below you. You'll also find rocks that work very much like the spinning blades from Jill, but that fire annoyingly upwards and over any enemies directly in front of you, and powerful fireballs that go all the way through enemies. Again, like in Jill, you'll find items that will temporarily turn Engelbert Humperdinck into other creatures or let him explore underwater areas, breaking up the platforming a little. And you also have some other standard platforming game furniture like rapid fire, a pair of shoes that let you jump higher, and some springs that shout AOL. You can restore your health by picking up hearts, or by collecting 16 food items to restore 1 point of health. In an amusingly subtle message, fruit will count towards this health total, but items like lollipops and cakes will not. Throughout, the game feels like it's meant to be a bit of a fantasy-themed answer to Apogee's Duke Nukem, which had been released a couple of years earlier, all the way down to including the gift-wrapped boxes that fall from the sky and may or may not contain a deadly amount of high explosive. It plays well enough, but one annoyance is that the game is absolutely packed full of instant death that comes in two different forms. First, the levels include obstacles like water, lava and spikes that kill Peregrine Wursthorn instantly and send him all the way back to the start. And second, because there's absolutely no concept of mercy invincibility. If you get stuck in a group of enemies, they can absolutely devastate your health bar by hitting you very quickly in succession, and there's no time to get your bearings between hits, so you really have to proceed carefully to avoid suddenly being killed from full health. The levels are just a few minutes long and you're never put back very far as a result of dying, and you also have unlimited lives, but from a modern standpoint it's very frustrating to have to repeat a level because you were a tiny bit careless right at the end. And this isn't exactly a game-breaking problem, but I couldn't help noticing a scoring bug in the first episode where the robot enemies suddenly become worth .15784 points and kick your score up to the 32-bit integer limit. However, one interesting and fairly original feature of the game serves to mitigate this problem a little. By hitting B, you can call up an item shop at any time, where you can spend the green emerald pickups that you've collected throughout the levels on items to make your life a little easier. You can buy back health points, get extra firepower, or even invulnerability without having to find them as pickups in the levels, and if you choose the right moment to use it, this can really drag Benedict Cumberbatch out of a bad situation without desperately having to search for health. Zargon is a pleasant enough platform game, even though it doesn't do anything too surprising, and it's definitely a worthy successor to Jill of the Jungle, building on the engine and doing new things with it. Just like he did for Kiloblaster, Allen Pilgrim released Zargon as freeware in 2008 and included the source code in the release. It can all be downloaded from the classic DOS Games archive. If you have the ability to compile it, the source for an SDL conversion of the game by Adam Nielsen is also available on GitHub, appropriately under the name Malvinius.